Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session of our Career Development Series. My name is Helena Branco. I'm a PhD student at the University of Porto, Portugal, and I am moderating this talk together with my colleague Carlos Jesus from the University of Coimbra, also in Portugal. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Zack Troyer, a dedicated scientist with a background in microbiology and virology. Dr. Zack Troyer earned his PhD at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and is now a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University, where he's been furthering his research since 2021. Dr. Troyer's work focuses on understanding extracellular vesicle surface contents, structure, and cellular interactions so that his knowledge can be used in EV engineering to provide therapeutic options against a variety of diseases. Today, however, you'll be sharing with us some insights on how to write during our PhD, covering everything from effective time management and balancing writing with bench work, to framing paper outlines and drafting dissertation chapters, along with advice on getting constructive feedback from mentors. I request the audience to put their questions in the chat box or to unmute yourself and ask the questions at the end of the talk. Now, Dr. Zack Troyer, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Let me just share my screen momentarily. And thanks again to the SNEV committee for inviting me to give this talk today. It's an honor. I'm happy to be able to help add some of my experiences and knowledge I've gained going through the PhD process to help others in writing. So that's going to be the focus of my talk today. It's a little unusual to not be presenting about my scientific work, but writing is also something very important that we all have to learn how to do in our PhDs, and it's just a very useful scientific skill. So today I'm going to cover tips and tricks for writing. That'll include actual, advice about writing sentences themselves and writing structure, but then also just tips around writing, like how to manage time with writing and other such things. And so I've kind of broken my talk down into about 4 topics that we're going to go through. The first being time management with writing and juggling that with experiments, which is something we have to learn when we're in a lab. And then, of course, building and writing a research article manuscript. Being able to write these for presenting our results is, of course, essential. And then, very importantly, writing your thesis, which is something that can be a bit scary, but something that most of us are going to have to go through at some point. And then lastly, an important, often overlooked aspect, which is seeking writing feedback from your mentor, which is something that can allow you to build your skills. So starting with the first topic, time management. I think this one is very important and something that we have to learn in a PhD, and it's something that's not always taught prior to starting a PhD. I do think it's one of the most difficult things to learn, and it kind of it relates to questions such as, what is the appropriate amount of time to spend writing a paper or writing your results versus actually doing experiments while you're in your PhD, and then of course, how do I even find the time to write when I have all these experiments I'm doing? It can be a bit overwhelming. It can sometimes feel like you're too busy. So I'm hoping to provide some tips that can help you to manage that. So one tip that I've found useful is to plan out each day with time blocks. So what I mean by that is thinking about how your day is going to go and what things you have to do in advance. So maybe at the beginning of the week, you sit down and you think about each day, and you can actually plan out blocks of time to do different things. So maybe you have a block of time from 8 a.m. to noon where you are working on an experiment, but then you also plan a block from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. where you're designating some time for writing. So just having that planned in advance can really help to foster intentionality to actually sit down and write. And when you designate a block or chunk of time for writing, it doesn't have to be a super long, multiple hour block. It can be something as small as maybe a 30-minute chunk of time where you have free and you can sit down and think a bit about writing. Just having those, even those small blocks of time can be helpful. Um, and then a last point relating to this, be intentional about following your scheduled plans, your time blocks. Like try your best to actually use them as you wrote them down. So if you have a time set aside for writing, try and do that. But you also need to be flexible with yourself because the PhD can be a bit unpredictable. You never know how experiments are going to go or what things are going to come up in the day. So sometimes you will need flexibility to just avoid forget about doing a time of writing that you were planning to and focus on experiments. It's just something we have to learn. Setting writing goals is also something that can be very helpful. And I put also using date targets. And what I mean with that is perhaps setting a goal. I want to finish the methods section of this paper by June 18th. So picking a date associated with it gives it more of a, I guess, a real impact in that it's something concrete that you have to accomplish. If you just say, "Oh, I want to finish the results section soon," well, it might be easy to procrastinate that to the next day. But if you know that you've set a date that you want to complete it by, you might stick more to that. And additionally, if you reward yourself for achieving these goals in some way, whether that be buying a coffee for yourself, going to see a movie, just whatever it is for you, rewarding yourself for your goals will incentivize you to actually stick to these goals and follow these goals. And then another tip that I personally have found that I can't really do, but so it doesn't work for everyone, but using incubation periods and wait steps to write, it can work for some people. I find that I have trouble switching my mindset and my focus to another topic for just a short window of time. But some people are very good at, using a 30-minute spin to just sit down and maybe write a little bit on a page. So if it works for you, it can definitely be useful. And you don't want to just be sitting there doing nothing, staring at the centrifuge or something like that. So that can be another nice tip. Now, this is an interesting one that I've come across during my time when I was writing my thesis. It's called the Pomodoro technique, and it's a strategy of using chunks of focus time interspersed with breaks to efficiently write, or even just efficiently accomplish any tasks. But in this case, of course, we're talking about writing. So the way the Pomodoro technique works is you know what task you have. You set a timer for whatever amount of time. Here in the example, it's 25 minutes, but really it can be whatever you want it to be, maybe an hour. And then you work on your task until that timer rings, and then you take a 5-minute short break. And so you repeat that process 4 times. And then after the 4 times of repeating, you take a longer break where you can maybe do something else for a little while. And so that's just a way to not get overwhelmed and be able to kind of break up the monotony of working on the same thing for long periods of time, but still remaining focused. And I put a picture here. So this is actually from a website. You can find these types of timers online. Some of them are on these nice websites that also have music and ambient backgrounds. And they have these built-in timers, so you can actually have these Pomodoro timers and have them running while you're writing. And so there's a lot of nice functionality, a lot of nice tools on the internet for these kind of things. So this is another one that I've learned about recently. So there's these things called writing accountability groups that I've noticed are becoming more common, at least in the US, in universities. And what that is basically just having a group of people um, to whom you're accountable for in your writing progress. So maybe that means you meet once a week and you all sit down in the same room and you all sit there and write for an hour or two together in the same room so that you can all see that you're working and you're actually having somebody checking on your progress and asking you, did you write? Did you get anything down today? And so some people, as you can see, I got this email recently. Some people are taking the initiative to set up these groups. Sometimes university writing centers or organizations will set up these groups. But you can also take the initiative and start one yourself. It doesn't have to be super formal. You can just talk to your colleague in your lab and say, hey, I'm trying to write. Can you check on me like 2 days from now and see if I've made any progress? Those kind of things make it a little easier to get progress than if you're just relying on yourself only. So, okay, now that we've talked about some timing and time management tips, I also wanted to talk about, of course, writing a research manuscript. And the question that comes up there is how do I even start? Sometimes it can feel a bit overwhelming. A paper is obviously a big thing, and it's got a lot of parts. So if you just jump right into it and you're saying, oh gosh, where should I start? How do I do this? Don't feel overwhelmed because there are, I think, good ways and good tips that I can provide that can help you to tackle starting writing a research paper. One of the things that I found very useful is writing a manuscript outline or a figure outline. Um, this is You can think of this as a picture version of the story you want your paper to tell. So maybe that means that you actually sketch out the graphs that you envision being in your future manuscript. Maybe like the experiments you want to do, and what you're hoping the results look like, so you can just make some graphs. So here's actually an example of a figure outline I found for my recent paper that came out a couple months ago. So I like to do handwritten ones. Of course, some people might prefer to do these in PowerPoint or Illustrator or other softwares, but having these figure outlines can really get you a start into knowing what topics do you need to cover in your introduction. What is the general area that your research is going to be in? What question is it answering? And it will also very much help you when it comes time to actually write the results section. When you have your results, you can look back at this and know what you should be talking about and in what order. Um, in this picture here, I also have a more general outline of the entire paper. So not just the figures for the results section, but you can see there's results, there's the actual abstract and background introduction, that kind of thing, discussion. So these are all some of the important sections we're going to talk about. And you can also make an outline that includes all of these things if you want. But I just think outlining in general is a very good way to start, where you can fill in the gaps later as you think about things. Another type of outline that is interesting and is one I haven't really used before, but recently one of my colleagues was telling me about that they do this technique. I call it a structured paper outline. It's a lot more of a structured outline, but basically what you can do is have an outline where it says, I want to write 2 sentences about X topic. Let's say, I don't know, EVs in mitochondria. And then following that, I know that I want to have 3 sentences about a certain knowledge gap that exists in the field about this topic. So if you can kind of write down how many sentences you want devoted to each topic, and that can be a sense of an outline too that you can follow. It's a lot more detailed, but then you can actually follow that and fill in the sentences, and then maybe you can change that later. But as I said, it doesn't work for everyone, but it can be useful. Some of it really just depends on your preferred method of outlining. So this is also, I think, very important when you're writing a research manuscript, the topic of reference management. So how do you actually keep track of all the papers that you've read and all the citations that you want to make when you're actually writing the manuscript? So there are a lot of really good softwares out there that can allow you to compile these papers and sort them by author names and by you can actually in some of these programs you can add notes and add your own comments about a paper. So maybe you want to summarize what the takeaway from the paper is and what you want to use it for, what citation you're going to use it for. So these softwares are, I think, indispensable. I've relied on them very heavily. Zotero is the one I use most often. It's a open access free software. And the nice thing is it has compatibility with both web browsers and with Microsoft Word writing applications. So you can see here this picture. This is the Zotero tab when I've added this plugin. And as I'm writing, I can go through, and as long as I have Zotero open on my computer, I can actually directly add the citations into the text, and it will actually format them according to the journal style that you've selected. And then once you've added all your citations and you're at the end of your manuscript, you just click this button about adding and editing the bibliography, and it will actually just do the full works cited section for you based on the order of the citations that you did. And I don't have a picture of this here, but you can actually install plugins for Zotero in Google Chrome. So while you're reading a paper, you can actually just click a button and it will automatically add that paper to your Zotero collection. And it will actually download the PDF if it's available. So it will be locally stored on your computer. So I find Zotero very useful. I can't really speak to EndNote, RefWorks, or Mendeley. I know that those are other reference management softwares that people use, but I highly recommend that you take advantage of one of these softwares. Start early and start compiling your interesting papers that you've read in this type of software, so that they're ready for you and you don't have to go and search for them and find them. Oh, what was that interesting paper I read? And then you have to Google search and then you can't find it. So that kind of avoids that issue. Now, similarly, speaking about citations, not only is it important to use the reference manager, but when you're actually choosing an article to cite, you really do want to check the quality of the article that you're citing. Make sure that the article supports the conclusion that you're citing them for. So go in and don't just cite a paper based on what it says it proved in the abstract, but actually go and look at what their results are and see if it supports their conclusion. And also see that whatever fact you're citing it for is actually proved or is supported in that manuscript. You don't want to run into a problem of relying on flimsy citations where reviewers might not like that if they go and look and they see that, oh, this, I don't really like this citation. And then another important question is when you're actually using citations to support a statement of fact or a statement of some sort of finding, how many citations do you need? You'll see that some papers, they might have like 10 citations for a single sentence. Others might just have one. I don't know if there's necessarily a right answer to how many, but I guess you can think of it as a factor of how important of a statement is this. Is this something that's very, very well supported in the literature and something that's well known? Or is this something new that maybe you want to cite 2 or 3 articles to really give more evidence that it's a real thing and convince people? So I can't really say if there's a right answer there, but just think about how many citations you want. And also, some of that will be limited by the journal that you're submitting your article to. They might have a limit on how many citations you can have. So this is an interesting topic. So using active or passive voice when you're actually writing. This is a bit of a tricky one. So active versus passive voice, it is determined by the order of the subject, the verb, and the object of the sentence. So an example of an active voice statement is Rena gave me the book, where a passive voice would be the book was given to me by Rena. So it's a bit of a reversed order. Now, in scientific writing, it's generally recommended to primarily use the active voice when you can, but there are instances in parts of a paper in which it makes more sense and it's recommended to use the passive voice. Often the passive voice is used when you want to take the focus off of the subject of the sentence, the person doing the thing. So for example, in the methods section, generally you want to use the passive voice because the focus shouldn't really be on the person doing the method, but rather the focus should be on the method itself, the thing being done, so that people can read the methods and be able to replicate your work or replicate your experiments. So an example of a scientific passive statement is cells were transfected with 3 micrograms of plasmid. Another example of when to use the passive voice, when you're perhaps in your results section, if you're reporting a result where the object of the action is still unknown, let's say that the thing that caused some sort of effect or outcome that you observed is unknown, you might want to use the passive voice. So as an example of the sentence, in the lymph nodes, CD4 and CD8 T cells were significantly reduced in PTGFRN deficient mice compared to wild type mice at 7 days post inoculation. So in this case, we actually don't know what caused the decrease in CD4 and CD8 T cells, and we're not really making a claim as to what that might be. So it's using the passive voice makes more sense because we don't know what is causing this decrease. We can't say that X thing caused the decrease in the CD4 and CD8 T cells. Now for the active voice, it would be a sentence like, we transfected cells with 3 micrograms of plasmid. This is more useful in results when you're talking about what you did after a previous result. So something like, given this finding or given this data, we performed TEM imaging analysis. So that would be a time that you want to use more of the active voice. So this as I said, this one can be a bit tricky, but it is actually important for writing a manuscript and making it coherent and concise. So I also wanted to talk a bit about rough drafts. Um, so I think it's important to not get caught up trying to make your sentences perfect right away. And I fall into this trap quite often. I might sit there and I'm trying to just write one sentence, but I keep deleting it, rewriting it, trying to get it to sound perfect before I even move on to the next sentence. But I have found it useful to just get the words and sentences on the page in a rough form, even if you don't necessarily like how it sounds at the moment, but just getting the idea on the page and getting it out there makes it a lot easier to get your thoughts out. And you can always come back later and edit and change them to sound better or to flow better. But if you spend too long on one sentence, you might let your thoughts run away from you, and then you might lose your train of thought. You might forget the next thing that you wanted to focus on. So just try and get a rough draft together, and then just later on you can go back and change it. That's something that as I said, I struggle with this, but it definitely is useful. So pertaining to the order of a manuscript, where should you start? So most of us know there's generally a couple sections of research paper, usually an introduction, followed by the methods and the results section, and then finally a discussion and conclusion section. So as I said, where do you start with this? I would say that the methods section tends to be the easiest place to start because it's generally, you're not really writing opinion, you're just writing what did you do. Presumably you already have that written down somewhere, maybe in your lab notebook, maybe on a virtual lab notebook online. So you can just kind of use that material that you maybe already have, or you can use a protocol that you've printed out and just write your methods section. And that can help you to at least get started. I would also say that the discussion section should generally be the last thing that you write in a manuscript. And that's because the discussion section is supposed to be a summary of everything that's in your paper. You're supposed to kind of take everything that you've shown, the introduction, the results, wrap it all together and summarize it, and then talk about the implications of your work and what your findings are and what would be the future directions and what are the weaknesses. So it requires a lot of the other material to already be there to think about how to write the discussion section. So I think it should come last. Now, whether or not you write the results or introduction first, or right after the methods, or you do it introduction right after the methods, that's I think just a personal preference. My personal preference is methods first, then results, then the introduction, and then the discussion. I like to get the results on the page before I think about what I should be writing in the introduction and what topics I should be focusing on, because sometimes the results kind of guide you to know which topics you want to focus on and introduce your readers to. Now, writing style is also very important when you're writing a research manuscript. And what I'm referring to when I talk about writing style is it going to be very wordy, very long sentences, or is it going to be something that's more concise and to the point? Um, so I think that conciseness is important in a research paper. Of course, when we're writing a scientific paper, it is important to use scientific language. But just because we use scientific language doesn't mean it has to be overly complicated. And I think sometimes I can run into the trap of making my sentences much too long because I want to convey a lot of different information, and I feel like it should all be in together in one sentence. But I think it's better to break this up into multiple sentences. And if you can find a word that tells the same story without like a shorter word or a smaller word that tells the same story as a bigger word. I think sometimes it is useful to use the smaller one to be more concise. I think reviewers, when they're looking at a paper, they do appreciate the conciseness. They I'm sure there's exceptions, but I think most reviewers I've talked to don't like when they have very long run-on sentences. And every time I've written a paper, I've always got feedback that I should probably shorten the paper. So I think conciseness is important. But again, you do want to use scientific language. You just don't want it to be overly complicated. And something that can help with writing concisely is to think about what does each sentence that you're writing actually drive the narrative, the story of your research paper? Does it contribute something? And if you find a sentence that you feel like deleting it wouldn't actually change the meaning of the paragraph, then maybe it's not something that's necessary, and you can get rid of it. So try and identify sentences that really aren't doing anything after you've already written some. Now, versioning is something that I've started using a lot more recently. And what I'm talking about when I talk about versioning is saving multiple versions of your manuscript document. So maybe that means that every time you make a change, or every time that you have finish a day's worth of writing, you save a new version of the document, perhaps with today's date. Um, and then tomorrow, the next day, when you write and you change some things, maybe you save another version with that date. And I think that that's useful, because oftentimes we might decide later on that we liked how we had written things initially, and you'll want to have that version available to go back and see how you wrote things before, and then you can use that sentence structure. But if you're constantly just saving over everything in the same document, I know that Word does have some recovery functions and you can see multiple versions, but it's a little more difficult to find those. And um, I think it's just useful to have multiple copies, if you can have the disk space for that, of course, on your computer. Um, and you don't have to save a new version after every single small change that you make, but it's up to you how you do this. Now, something I've noticed with Microsoft Word recently is they introduced this autosave function that often I've noticed is just automatically on. And so what happens is as soon as you start writing, it just overwrites your previous whatever was there previously, and it auto saves that into the file that you're working on. So I like to turn that off if I'm going to use this versioning technique, so that it doesn't just overwrite my previous day's work, and then I can save it as a new version when I'm ready. But it can be useful for some people. Just keep that in mind. And of course, something that you've probably heard many times about your data, but this is also relevant to your manuscripts. Back up your data and store it in different versions on different in different places even. Put it on a hard drive, keep it under your bed, keep one in a locker somewhere. It's just good to always have different versions of things so that you don't have a catastrophic loss. And I'm sure some of us have had it happen before. It's not fun when you lose a whole day's worth of writing, or even more than that. So, so just some final tips for writing your manuscript. Something that I've been recommending to people is to avoid overly strong statements relating to your results. So when you're actually writing your results section, you want to be careful to not overrepresent or overstate the significance of your findings. As an example here, I have two sentences. So the first one is a bit strong. It says, we have proved that EVs influence mitochondrial function. So saying that we proved that is a very strong statement. It's suggesting that really you know exactly what's happening, that the EVs are definitely causing the effect. Um, and you might get hit by a reviewer for these kind of statements. I've had it happen before. A better statement would be something like, our data suggests that EVs influence mitochondrial function. Um, this leaves a little more room for there to be alternative interpretations, or maybe someone could then come later and prove that it's not exactly what you thought, and something different is happening. So just avoiding those overly strong statements can be useful. I'm sure there are times where it's okay to have an overly strong statement where you've proved something 10 different ways and you see the same thing every time. But just as a general rule of thumb, I like to avoid overly strong statements like that. And then, of course, when you're writing in your discussion section, you want to remember to acknowledge the limitations of your study within your writing. And this means just acknowledge the weaknesses, acknowledge the things that maybe you weren't able to test, acknowledge maybe alternative interpretations that could explain the results that you see. And this just makes you a more rounded scientist and shows the reviewers that you're really thinking about all the different implications of your research and the different things that could be happening. So now I want to talk about writing your thesis, which is obviously a very big undertaking. It's a much bigger undertaking than writing just a research manuscript. But I do want to state that all the things that I just talked about relating to tips for writing can apply to writing your thesis as well. But here I'm going to talk about some specific tips for writing a thesis. Um, so the first thing that I would say is that the format of a thesis can vary, and it often depends on the institution that you're doing your research at. So, if you can look at if your department or your university provides some sort of guidelines for how they want the format of your thesis. I've seen that in the U.S. it varies based on the institution, and so that's important to look and see if they have limitations for how many pages or how many words, things like that. So starting with some tips, one of the things you can do is start a working document as you go through your PhD. And what I mean by a working document is having a Word document perhaps that you continuously are adding things to. Every time, let's say you read an interesting paper, every time you have an interesting thought, or you find an interesting result, you can put that into this document. And you can keep this same document over, I don't know, however many years you're doing your work. And this will be a great reference when it comes time to write your thesis, to be able to go back and look at what your thoughts were, let's say 2 years ago, and look at a summary of a paper that you read 2 years ago that you might have forgotten about. So just having that document that you've compiled will prove very useful. And it can really include whatever you want, ideas, summaries of papers, anything. But just having that there, having a physical thing that you can go back and look at can be useful. So similar to writing a paper, you have to think about with your thesis, how are you going to break up the different sections within a thesis? I think these are generally called chapters, but I also recommend making an outline of this, similar to what we did with the paper manuscript, before you start jumping in and trying to actually write. Um, I I assume that your thesis will likely be broken into chapters, although I guess you would need to check your institution guidelines. That's how I've always seen theses work. Um, and as I said, knowing what each chapter will include will help you to plan out your writing and what you need to address. Um, and then something that I've come across in in my PhD institution, it was common for some of us to use a first author publication as one of the chapters of our thesis. And so when we wanted to do this, we actually had to reach out and request permission from the journal in which the paper is published in to do this. Because generally, when you publish a research article, there will be some sort of copyright that's held by the journal. So you actually have to request permission to use it as a chapter. So I actually used one of my papers as my chapter 3, and I had to do that. So just keep that in mind. But generally, the breakdown of a thesis is there's usually a first chapter that's an introduction, and then I've seen any number of chapters that are focused on the work that you did and the projects that you accomplished. And then finally, there will be a chapter where you talk about the conclusions and future directions of your work. And so just having an outline of what these different sections want to cover is a good start. Now, focusing on the introductory chapter, this is a strong introductory chapter to your thesis is very important. This chapter is essentially a large-scale literature review covering the topic of your research. And there's really not as much of a need to be as concise as you would with like an introduction to a research article, unless you're under some sort of program page limitation. But you should really think of this as a very broad introduction to your research field. You want it to be a piece of work that can explain to someone who maybe knows nothing about your research field, to explain to them what your research is about, the important background to your topic, the important educational background. And for in an introduction, I think it's okay to have multiple citations to back up important points. So previously I talked about maybe it's okay sometimes to just use one citation for a statement when you're writing a paper. But I think with an introduction, it's totally okay to have multiple citations for different statements, and that really just that will show your thesis committee when they're actually reviewing this that you've really investigated the introductory material in your field, that you really know your field well, and that you know the important papers in your field. Now, equally important to the introduction chapter is the conclusions and future directions chapter, the final chapter of your dissertation. The reason that I think that this is very important is it tells a couple different important things to your review committee. It tells them how well can you summarize the results of your research. It tells them how well you can critically think about the implications of your research. And it also tells them how well you can foresee the ideal next steps for advancing your research. So it really, I think the important point is the critical thinking. It shows that you can think critically, that more than just representing the results, you can think about what the results mean in your field. How do your results push your field forward and push an area of knowledge forward? And you can think about all the positives and negatives of the implications of your research. And you can think about what would be the next steps that you need to accomplish to I guess generate the next paper or get the next grant for your research. So those are things that in my experience that thesis committees really want to see. Now this relates a bit back to the time management aspect. Now time management with a thesis is a lot different than time, in my opinion, is a lot different than time management with a paper. And it's going to come down to your lab and your preferred method of working. The first thing I'll say is that you should talk to your mentor, your PI, or your investigator, about what they prefer for how you work on your thesis. So some mentors might be okay with you stepping out of the lab for a period of time to work solely on the thesis. Others might want you to remain in the lab and still be doing experiments while you're working on your thesis. So that's a conversation that you should have with your mentor. But for those that that can get this opportunity, some people do prefer to have a period where they're doing no bench work at all and they're really focusing 100% on just writing their thesis. And if you're that kind of person and you're doing that, the important aspects are the important aspects are what kind of environment do you put yourself in, and how do you keep yourself focused. So you can use some of the techniques I previously talked about with time management, but also your environment's important. Do you write better at home? Do you write better at the lab in an office somewhere? Do you write better at a coffee shop or at some restaurant? What kind of food and drinks do you have around you? Do you listen to music? These are all things you're going to have to find out for yourself, but find your comfortable environment that incentivizes you and helps you to write the best, and focus on that. Now, for those who maybe can't just take time off the lab completely to write their thesis, uh, it can be useful to use the time block method that I talked about previously, but just having a larger block of time than you would for a paper. So maybe instead of devoting 1 hour a day for writing, you need to have a 4 hour chunk of time where you're focused just on your thesis. And so maybe you come in the morning and you do your experiments, and then after lunch, you focus only on writing your thesis. Um, but again, it kind of comes down to your personal preference. But it's just think about these different options and talk with your mentor, and see what they expect of you, for writing your thesis. Now, the last topic I want to cover relates to both writing a thesis and writing a paper, and that is seeking writing feedback. And this is something that I think has not always been taught very well to us as PhD students, but it's very important for developing your writing skills and improving as a PhD scholar. Um, and it will also help you find your unique writing style. And so when I'm talking about seeking writing feedback, I'm talking about asking somebody to give you critical advice on your writing, to tell you how you can improve your writing. So relating to this, you would think, who can you ask for feedback? There's a lot of people. You can ask your PI or your mentor, your principal investigator. Um, Maybe you have some other professors or mentors that, maybe they're not, you're not in their lab, but they're a mentor to you and you trust them to give you writing advice. Of course, all of us have colleagues that we work alongside, and sometimes they can provide valuable writing advice if they're experienced, and or if they just are writing at the same time. And lastly, if this is something available to you at your university, there are many universities that have writing centers that are focused solely on improving writing, helping you with your writing skills, providing writing workshops. So look into your university if it offers any of these kind of things. And with everything I just talked about, it's also important to keep in mind data sharing concerns. So, of course, all these people may be available for you, to help you with your writing, but maybe for data privacy reasons, you might not want to be sharing your research with a competitor or with someone who's publishing something in a similar field. So just keep that in mind before sending your paper off to anyone. You should talk to your mentor about it. Now, getting a little bit into specifics about getting this writing feedback, this is something that I went through in my PhD, and I had to kind of advocate for myself to get this experience. So, just to tell a little story, my PhD mentor, he mentored two PhD students before me, and both of them came in with a lot of experience, and they already were pretty good at writing. So, most of the time when they would submit manuscripts to him, he would just make changes without making any notes or anything like that, and just send it back, and they would just say okay, and they would submit it. And so really that was the process. But for me, I wanted to improve my writing, and so the first time that my mentor returned to me a document and he had changed a lot of things, and there wasn't really any comments or red marks about why he changed certain things, I actually had to email him and ask him to do it again, but provide me with the like the rationale, the reasoning behind why he made certain changes, why he felt that a certain sentence might be stronger a certain way or a certain word choice might be better. Because I wanted to understand his mind about why he thought certain things were better, the way that he was imagining in his mind. So I think it's just important to stand up for yourself and ask for that kind of feedback directly, if you can. Another thing you can do is you can ask your PI about how they like to receive and review your writing. Do they want to receive a complete document? Or do they prefer that every time you finish one section that you send it to them before you start the next section? That's just a discussion that you should have with your mentor. But getting back into that point of asking for intentional feedback, you can ask questions like, why was this passage changed? Why did you change this word? What can I do to improve my writing? Is it too passive? Is it too active? Am I making too strong of conclusions too often, or are my sentences being far too long? Just getting those kind of comments from your mentor can be very helpful to help you develop your writing style and improve your skills. And relating to this, the tracking changes and adding comments functionality within the word processors that we use, like Microsoft Word, can be very useful for this. It makes it a lot easier to have your PI or your mentor put these comments in the manuscript and then send it back to you. So some final tips relating to getting feedback, something that can be a very hard, but it relates to your attitude. So it's important to try not to take negative feedback on your writing as a personal attack. And I'll say that I'm not very good at this. Like when I get comments back, it can be a bit hard, and it can make me feel like I'm being told that my writing is terrible and I'm not very good. But try not to take it as a personal attack. Most people, especially your mentor, wants you to succeed and they want your writing to improve. So they're using negative feedback as a means to help you improve and to help you get better. And then just one last tip. If you're writing in a language that's not your own primary language, sometimes you can look for language editing services. And in some cases, you can even have someone who's a native speaker be an author on your paper and agree to edit and review the manuscript. Now, whether or not they become an author can depend on a discussion with your mentor, because some mentors, some PIs have ideas about what it takes to be an author, and it would need in some cases editing alone wouldn't be enough to justify authorship, and they might want it to just be those who have contributed to the scientific content of the article. But in other cases, some PIs are willing to offer authorship just for editing in the primary language of that person's native language. So just that's something to keep in mind when you're writing. So that's all I have for today. I'm happy to take any questions. And thanks again for giving me this opportunity to share with you guys.
So thank you, Zach. It was a really interesting and a really nice talk with a lot of tips. Some of them that I already use, but a lot of new tools for me to explore for sure, which is really really cool. I think we have one question now in the chat box. It is Morgan. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly? I'm not sure if she's
Hi,
here.
sure.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So your writing tips, and this may be like totally personal and maybe nobody else is struggling with these issues. I don't know if this is a common experience or if it's just the circumstances of my PhD, but I feel that I set like SMART goals, like specific, measurable, attainable, all those things.
Mm-hmm.
And then everything takes like 4 freaking times longer than I expect it to. So I set these like what I consider to be reasonable expectations of how long something should take me. But then
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it's like suddenly, as soon as I sit down to do something productive, the world is on fire. And so everything takes so long. And I don't know how to handle that, but I also don't know how to handle the feelings that come with that because to be perfectly honest, it's depressing. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make me want to sit down and write because I know that the second I do, something is going to happen. Inevitably, something will happen. And so I don't know how to handle the fact that things take forever, like just forever, and then feeling motivated when I know that things are going to take forever. So that's question one for you.
Okay. Yeah, so I have felt that same feeling before. I'm also pretty bad at accurately predicting how long things will take. So what I've had to do is I I write down my initial thought, that the first thought that comes to mind of how long something will take, and then I add like 4 days to it, because I know that my first thought is like going to be 4 days off. So you kind of have to rework how you think to get these goals to be more accurate. But then related to the motivation, knowing that things always take longer and being able to still motivate yourself, it can be hard. I think putting yourself into a good environment to write, your comfortable environment can help with that. Putting yourself in a comfortable place where you have your drink and your music, or whatever, that can help. And then to some extent, it's a bit hard when, if you're getting overwhelmed by experiments and things, that can sometimes relate to just how much of a share of work in the lab you're doing, and are other people putting in their fair share. So it's a bit hard to juggle, honestly, and there's not always an easy fix, unfortunately.
Yeah,
I hope that
I
helps a little
definitely
bit.
think though your point about maybe setting more accurate time expectations, I feel like that's the problem, right? Is that I want things to go so much faster than they do.
Yeah.
So maybe I need to adjust for timing like you suggested and just add a few days onto everything. And then
Mhm.
maybe I'll start to feel the opposite way because maybe I'll start getting things done in less time than I anticipated. But then I worry to some
We can
extent
hope.
that things take as long as you give them. So I'm also worried that if I allocate too much time, it
There,
will occupy all of that
there,
time simply because I've allowed it to, you know?
there is
So
that
that's
second concern
frustrating.
too. I felt that too, that like if I'm not ambitious about my goal, that I'm going to just take advantage of that and be like, oh, this isn't due for another 8 days, so I don't need to work on this now. So that really just comes into where you need to be intentional about following those writing schedules and sitting down, and that's where that accountability group that I talked about can come in handy a lot, because you won't be able to get out of writing if someone's coming to your desk and asking you, have you written today? I mean, it won't
Mhm.
work for everyone, but that's something that I think can help with that.
Yeah, I need to try to find that. I'm sure there's something like that at my university. I just need to figure out where. But to your other point, you said, about other people picking up their weight. This kind of feeds into my second question that right now I'm the senior grad student and I don't blame my peers. Obviously, they're first and second year grad students and they maybe don't know how to handle things. Um, but it's gotten to the point where I literally try not to go in at all on Mondays and Fridays if I can help it because things just get away from me. It's so bad. Like I have a plan for the
Hmm.
day and then suddenly I look up and it's 6 p.m. Not only have I not eaten, I also haven't done any of the things that I've planned for myself because everybody else needs help or there are these mini emergencies and some of them are not so mini. It just like I don't know if that's a common experience, if this is just like the phase of grad school where now I'm expected to, pick
Yeah.
up the slack. I'm sure I was annoying as a first and second year too, but like it's very hard then because I think it's like you just start to be good at this stuff and so how are you supposed to find time for anything else?
Yeah, that definitely is a common experience as you become more senior in your lab, and as you have a couple more years under your belt. I've I hear this actually a lot from my wife, who's also a postdoc. She's experiencing a lot of this right now, and it is something that sometimes you just have to have structural barriers to this kind of overwhelming aspect. Like you said, staying home. Like you said, you stay home on Monday or Friday. Like taking a day, if you can, taking a day where you can just stay home so you can not have those encounters and focus on writing can be a way around that. But to some extent, it is just a learning experience of learning how to juggle that. And sometimes you have to actually stand up for yourself and your time. If of course, there are emergencies where you absolutely are needed to go help that person, but there are other times where you can say, "Hey, I'm busy right now. Can I help you in an hour or two?" Um,
Mhm.
so just having having that ability to stand up for your respect for your time is something that's important.
Yeah. I mean, it goes to what you said too about asking for feedback. I think this is just a general struggle that I'm dealing with is being able to say no or ask for what I need and advocate for myself like that. So that I feel it goes hand in hand to some extent.
Hmm.
And I think it's just such a challenge to suddenly be able to do this in the final push, like the final year of my PhD. I'm suddenly having to alter these aspects of myself. And it's really hard, I think, to
Yeah.
to get it done when it's not, you know, intuitive or native to who you are as a person. Like, I'm not the kind of person who wants to say, no, I can't help you, or no, leave me
Right.
alone, you know?
It,
So I don't know if
I,
that's something that you struggled with as well.
yeah, I struggle with that too. I'm a people pleaser and I love to help. I love to help other people, but at a certain point you do have to forgo that and be like, hey, sorry, I'd love to help, but I need to work on this right now. So it is hard. It's antithetical to my nature, but I had to
Yeah.
kind of learn that, or else as you said, it's hard to get things done if you don't.
Mhm. Thank you for some of it is actionable advice. I'm gonna try to readjust my frame of reference for how long time should take for certain activities. I'm gonna try to find an accountability group. So thank you for that.
Great.
I really
Yeah,
appreciate you speaking with us and answering all my questions. I know that was a
of
lot.
course. No, you can always reach out to me too. My email's findable on Hopkins website, on Johns Hopkins website. So if you ever need to email me, you can. I can help.
Great. Thank you,
Thank you
Morgan,
so
for the
much.
question. I don't see any other question in the chat box, but if anyone has a question, just raise your hand. In the meantime, maybe I can add here one question because it was nice to usually I use EndNote, but it was also nice to hear about this Zotero. So my question would be, do you have any other kind of trick or tip? Because when we are writing, and of course, eventually you are going to have dozens, hundreds of papers to cite, and
Right.
eventually maybe it's going to be crazy difficult it's going to be difficult to know each paper by heart, or just by the authors or the title or whatsoever. So my question would be, do you have any other kind of tip or trick in which you handle how to organize your folders or this kind of technical stuff that
Yeah.
can help?
Yeah, so I do I use a lot of Zotero's inbuilt features to accomplish this. So it allows you to make different folders for where your citations go. So I make a folder for different topics. So I'll have a parent folder that is just for, you know, this manuscript, and then within that there will be multiple folders for different topics, general topics, that will then hold a couple papers. Maybe each topic will hold 10 papers or so. And then another functionality, I add a note to it, each paper, that gives a small summary of what I'm interested in about that paper and what it can be useful for. And then lastly, Zotero automatically, when it imports a citation from online, it adds keywords to attached to that paper, and you can actually search. There's like a search bar that you can search by the keywords. So if I'm thinking, oh, I'm trying to remember what that paper was about extracellular vesicles in cancer, and in sheep, or some random thing like that, you can type in like EV cancer sheep, and then maybe that paper will show up. So it's some of it is like the useful features offered by reference managers like Zotero, and just having like a folder structure, an organized folder structure, can be very useful for keeping track of the different citations.
Yeah, it makes sense to me to also to have this folder organization, and of course it's going to be completely different between people because
Right.
We are going to have our own way to organize the things, but I think it's a nice tip, or at least to think about it, because eventually it's going to save us some time for sure.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And if I may, just another quick question. That will be, you were talking about having on the outline of the thesis, for instance, or of the paper. But I would say this question is more related to the thesis. I'm guessing that for the introduction, as it's going to be way more detailed, and it's going to be a large collection of scientific articles and stuff, and to establish what is going to be the rest of the thesis. How do you think? So, of course, I would say it's important to have an outline of the introduction.
Yes.
And do you have any kind of tips also, like how to get a good outline of the introduction, because as you said, it's one of the most important chapters of the thesis. So I guess in that having a strong outline of this will be also really great.
Yeah, so for within the introduction for an outline, what I did was I thought about the major three topics. If I could break down my research into three like major areas, what are they? And then I devoted a subsection of the introduction, one subsection to each of these topics. So if I'm thinking back to my thesis, it was about EVs and viral proteins and how interactions between EVs and viral proteins influence how they interact with cells. So I had one section where I talked just about EVs. I had one section where I talked about viruses. And then I had a third section where I talked about the interaction between EVs and viruses and what is known about that. So I kind of broke it down, like the global topic, into like pieces, set each of those as subsections, and then even within that I had further like subsections for different topics. So I guess try and kind of like break down the topics into smaller subtopics and then devote different lengths of paragraphs for each subtopic. And that in when you're making an outline, that might just look like having you either have bullet points or you have like those numerical outlines where it's one and then it's like a Roman numeral one, or just A and B or whatever, however you want to do it. Just building that structure, trying to break it down into subsections if you can. It's okay to have multiple subsections or even subsections. Like I think I had like 3 tiers of subsections within my introduction. So that's totally acceptable, at least as far as I understand it in my dissertation. According to my format at Case Western Reserve University, that was totally cool. So that's what I did for that.
And I'm guessing that this kind of overlapping that you were mentioning, that it was your last section,
yes,
that will be combining what you know about both fields, and but at the same time you are showing what is missing, and that's why you have your thesis, right?
Exactly. So yeah, you highlight with that last like introductory section, you highlight what is the gap of knowledge that you're filling in. You're exactly right. And then that leads you right into your results and what you found.
Sounds really cool. Thank you so much. So I don't see any question in the chat box. And anyone else, I don't think that we have any other questions. So I think we can wrap up the session. Once again, thank you so much on behalf of SNEV for giving this talk. I think it was really, really good for a lot of us, because or we are starting to write the thesis, or we are going to need it soon. So, and it's always really good to learn from people that went through that moment not that long ago, so we can relate more easily, I would say. Thank you once again, Dr. Zack, for your talk, and thank you everyone for joining this talk. See you on the next time.
Thank you.